Chapter III of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 3. 1793 to 1795. Toulon and Vendémiaire. We have now arrived at what Vandal calls l'avènement de Bonaparte, the commencement of his career. As yet, to all outward appearance, the little captain of artillery was the same slim, ill-proportioned, and rather insignificant youth. His head was shapely, his forehead wide, and of medium height. His light brown hair fell in stiff flat locks over his lean cheeks. His eyes were large and blue-gray in color, with a penetrating glance. The nose was Roman and finely formed, the mouth small, the lips full and sensuous, the chin round and firm. His complexion was sallow. The frame of his body was small and fine, particularly his hands and feet; but his deep chest and short neck were powerful. His gait was firm and steady. His mien was generally sombre, but when he smiled and showed his beautiful teeth and his wonderful eyes brightened, he charmed every one then as ever. His career thus far had been so commonplace as to awaken little expectation for his future. His education had not gone beyond the essentials of his profession, but had been supplemented by a wide course of reading. He could master details as no man before or since, and he had a vast fund of information at his command. His conception of men and affairs was not scientific, but it was clear and practical. Up to the present time he had showed no taste for the trade of arms, the routine and petty details of which he heartily disliked. Nor had he yet given any signs of that mastery of strategy and tactics which he had derived from his study and analysis of the exploits of the great world conquerors. So far, he seemed a man neither much better nor much worse than the world in which he was born, but he was far greater than those about him in perspicacity, adroitness, adaptability, and perseverance. As yet these qualities of leadership were scarcely recognizable, but they existed. On their arrival at Toulon, the Bonapartes settled in the village of La Valette, at the gates of that city, but after a short stay they removed to Marseilles. The life of the refugees at first was one of dire poverty. But presently brighter days dawned for them. Joseph was appointed a commissioner with the army, and Lucien a superintendent of stores. In August, 1794, Joseph married Julie, the daughter of Monsieur Clary, a wealthy silk merchant of Marseilles, who had been a good friend of the family during their period of distress, and who now richly endowed his daughter. Masson states that she received a dot of 150,000 francs, a sum equivalent to $1.5 million to-day. About the same time there was also some talk of a marriage between Napoleon and Désirée, another daughter, but nothing came of it, and she afterwards married Bernadotte, the future King of Sweden. Lucien, in the meanwhile, had taken as his wife Catherine Boyer, the daughter of an innkeeper at St. Maximin, where he was stationed. She was absolutely illiterate, but was a young woman of excellent character, and made him a good wife. On his return from Corsica, Napoleon had rejoined his regiment at Nice, where 4 companies were stationed, the remainder being at the headquarters at Grenoble. Here he found in command of the artillery of the army of Italy, Chevalier du Theil, the brother of his old friend. He attached Napoleon to the service of the coast batteries. At this time there was a general revolt in the departments of the South against the Constitution of 1793. The army of Carteaux, of which Napoleon's regiment was a part, was employed in putting down the rising. Napoleon himself was sent on various missions to Lyons, Valence, Avignon, and Beaucaire. It was in the last named place that he wrote the remarkable pamphlet, Le Souper de Beaucaire, which was printed at the public expense, and brought his name favorably to the attention of the Convention. It purports to record a discussion between an officer, Napoleon himself, 2 merchants of Marseilles, and citizens of Nîmes and Montpellier. It urges the need of united action under the lead of the Jacobins. This is a fight to the death between French patriots and the despots of Europe. The Revolution must not be stamped out by the foreign invaders. On the ground of mere expediency, men must rally to the cause of the Republic, and condone even the crimes of the Jacobins if they save the country. Better the reign of terror than the vengeance of the Ancien Régime. Such was the instinct of all men of patriotic feelings, and it saved France. As an exposé of keen policy and all dominating opportunism, Le Souper de Beaucaire is admirable. Shortly after its publication Napoleon had his first real chance in active military service. Toulon, which was one of the places in revolt against the Convention, had opened its gates to the English, under Admiral Hood, and they were now in possession of the city. Carteau was ordered to drive the enemy out, and proceeded there with his forces. Daumartin, who was in command of the artillery, was severely wounded in an early skirmish, and Napoleon was appointed to his place. Toulon was regarded at this time as one of the strongest fortresses in the world. The place was soon closely invested by Carteau, and the supply of water cut off. There were very few cannon when Napoleon took charge, and his first care was to raise the strength of this arm. The success of the siege depended upon the ability of the French to compel the retirement of the English fleet. Napoleon, on his arrival before the place, on the 12th of September, at once saw that this could be effected by seizing the point called l'Aiguillette, which commands both the inner and outer roadsteads of Toulon. At the first council of war, he placed his finger on the military map at this point of land at the mouth of the harbor, several miles from the fortifications of the town, and said with true Napoleonic brevity, "Voilà Toulon." But Carteau, who was a vain, pompous man, an artist by profession, with very little knowledge of the science of war, would not recognize the importance of this position. The English, however, had become aware of their danger, and erected a fort on the summit of the promontory. Napoleon was furious, but he did not give up his idea. His activity was prodigious, and he spared no efforts to get together a siege train and an adequate supply of ammunition. Napoleon was disgusted with the slowness of the siege, which lasted over 2 months. At last Carteau was recalled, and the command was given to Dugommier, with special orders to carry on the siege with vigor. He did much to re establish discipline. He quickly appreciated the talent of Napoleon, and took his view of the primary importance of the promontory. On the 17th of December, after a bombardment of 3 days, the English works on the promontory were finally taken by storm. Napoleon greatly distinguished himself in the assault. The capture of l'Aiguillette decided the fate of the town. Just as Napoleon had predicted weeks before, the city of Toulon fell without receiving a shot. The English fleet at once set sail after blowing up the magazines, and on the 19th of December the French entered the town. General Dutheil wrote to Aubry, the Minister of War, "I have no words to describe the merit of Bonaparte. Much science has much intelligence, and too much bravery. This is but a feeble sketch of the qualities of this rare officer, and it is for you, Minister, to consecrate him to the service of the Republic." Napoleon had been named Chef de Bataillon the 29th of September, promoted to Adjudant General Chef de Brigade the 27th of October, and on the 22nd of December he received his provisional appointment as General de Brigade, which was confirmed by the government on the 7th of January, 1794. To have been at Toulon was always a passport to Napoleon's generosity. Even Carteau received a pension of 6,000 francs. Victor, Suchet, and Marmont became marshals of France, and were loaded with titles and honors. Desaix, whom Napoleon called the greatest of his generals, would certainly have been included in the list but for his untimely death at Marengo before the dawn of the Empire. Muiron was made an aide de camp the same day as Duroc, and was Napoleon's chief of staff in Italy. He fell at Arcole in saving the life of his chief. The story of how Junot first attracted Napoleon's attention at Toulon is too well known to repeat here. He also became an aide de camp and a duke. "Such was the young Napoleon," says Browning, "at an age when young Englishmen are just taking their degree. Born of a noble family, but very poor, losing his father at an early age, with nothing but himself to depend upon, he had raised himself to the rank of general in the French army by no other arts than those of industry and steadfastness, high character and devotion to duty, supported, no doubt, by talents almost without example. In these first 23 years of his life there is not a single example of meanness or of dishonesty, or of any derogation from the high standard of conduct which he had set before himself. Surely, in his case also, the youth is father of the man; and 23 years spent under the most difficult circumstances which could try the qualities of a character, crowned by high success legitimately gained, are not likely to have been followed by 23 other years stained by universal ambition, reckless duplicity, and a nameless lust of bloodshed. The promotion of Napoleon meant a large increase in pay. As General of Brigade he received a salary of 15,000 francs a year, and in addition he had the right to lodging and rations. In January, 1794, he was appointed Inspector of Coasts with headquarters at Nice. His mother was settled at Antibes, a few miles away. At this moment, when for the first time the future seemed clear, a terrible blow fell upon him. On the 9 Thermidor, 27 July, 1794, the dictatorship of Robespierre came to an end. This meant disaster for all who were known to have been friends of the dictator, and Napoleon's relations with the younger Robespierre were a matter of common knowledge. He was denounced as a traitor, and on the 10th of August was arrested and imprisoned in Fort Carré, near Antibes. An examination of his papers, which had been seized, failed to reveal any grounds for the charges against him, and after 13 days he was released. A few weeks later, on the 14th of September, he was restored to his rank of general, and the same month took part in the operations of the army of Italy, which drove the Austrians from the crest of the mountains of the Riviera. He was then appointed to the command of the artillery in the expedition for the reconquest of Corsica, which was in the full possession of the English. The French navy, however, was in such wretched condition that the ships were not ready to sail before the month of March, 1795, and then an encounter with the English fleet resulted disastrously. 2 of the ships were captured, and the remainder took refuge in the Golfe Juan. After this the expedition was abandoned. The troops already on board the transports were disembarked and detailed to the army of Italy. Corsica was, for the moment, lost. Napoleon now received orders to take command of the artillery of the Army of the West, which was to subdue the Royalist uprising in La Vendée. Accompanied by his aides de camp Marmont and Junot, as also by his young brother Louis, he set out for Paris in May, 1795. He was not at all pleased with the assignment, which held out little prospect for military glory, but on his arrival in Paris he found even more disagreeable orders awaiting him. The Minister of War, Aubry, had transferred him from the artillery to the infantry on account of his youth. "One grows old quickly on the field of battle," was Napoleon's retort to the minister, who had never seen a day of active service. At that time Napoleon had the notion that any other service than the artillery was unworthy of him. Later, when he had had experience in command of an army, he saw that such specialization was not for the best interests of great operations, and that no matter what brilliancy artillery officers may show, they have rarely, perhaps never, the true esprit militaire. He became so convinced of this fact that in his first promotion of marshals of the Empire, he included no officer of artillery, and if later he gave to Marmont this high dignity, it was only through favor and on account of old friendship. However, Napoleon had no wish to break with the minister over this matter, and was not foolish enough to resign. He simply pleaded ill health as an excuse for not accepting the assignment, and lingered in Paris, hoping that something favorable might turn up. Ambitious, and fully conscious of his abilities and qualifications, it is not strange that Napoleon should have felt chagrined over the assignment. At the head of the Army of the North, Pichegru, who had been one of his masters at Brienne, had driven the enemy out of northern France, and was conquering the Low Countries. Jourdan, in command of the army of Sambre et Meuse, on the 26th of June, 1794, had defeated the Austrians in the battle of Fleurus. In December of the preceding year, Hoche, a man of his own age, had driven the Austrians out of Alsace, and covered himself with glory. Saint Cyr, a captain of volunteers in 1792, was now a general of division. Bernadotte, a sergeant major at the beginning of the Revolution, also commanded a division. Kléber, a volunteer 3 years before, had also reached the same rank, and so on. But notwithstanding Napoleon's disappointment, in reality fortune never favored him more than when she removed him from the coast of Provence and brought him to the center of all influence at Paris, where an able schemer could decide the fate of parties and governments. At the time of Napoleon's arrival in Paris, in the early summer of 1795, the city was just beginning to resume the customs and pleasures of the Ancien Regime, and the Terror was remembered only as a hideous nightmare. Gay equipages were again seen in the streets; Theatres were crowded. Gambling pervaded all classes of society. Men who had grown rich by speculation in the confiscated state lands, now vied with bankers and brokers in vulgar ostentation. The passing of the dark days of the Revolution was also being furthered by the unparalleled series of military triumphs. France had practically gained her natural boundaries, the Rhine and the Alps. In quick succession one government after another sued for peace: Tuscany in February, Prussia in April, Hanover, Westphalia and Saxony in May, Spain and Hesse Cassel in July, Switzerland and Denmark in August. Such was the state of France when Napoleon came to seek his fortunes in the capital. At this time Napoleon formed a close relationship with Barras, who had been brought into prominence by the events of the 9 Thermidor. As he afterwards explained at Saint Helena, "Robespierre was dead. Barras was playing a role of importance. And I had to attach myself to somebody or something." The career of Barras deserves a few words of notice. Paul Barras was born in Provence in 1755, of a good family. In his youth he served as a lieutenant against the British in India. In 1789 he was a member of the States General, and took an active part in the storming of the Bastille and the Tuileries. The siege of Toulon owed its success largely to his activity and energy. The overthrow of Robespierre, which ended the Terror, was accomplished mainly by him. On subsequent occasions, as President of the Convention, he acted with decision both against the intrigues of the Royalists and the excesses of the Jacobins. But the chief chance for immortality of the name of Barras lies in the fact that he was privileged to hold the stirrup for the great captain who vaulted lightly into the saddle. Probably through the influence of Barras, Napoleon was instructed at this time to prepare a plan for the campaign of the French army in Italy. The plans which he now submitted were essentially the same which he had prepared a year before at the request of Robespierre, but modified by the changes in the general political situation. In April, 1795, Prussia had retired from the contest, and made a separate treaty of peace with France. Negotiations were also under way with Spain, which were soon to lead to peace. The only remaining adversary of any importance on the continent was Austria, and Napoleon proposed to attack her in Italy. The Riviera having been seized and secured, the army of Italy, reinforced by the troops set free by the peace with Spain, would march along the coast and across the mountains into Piedmont, cut off the King of Sardinia from the Austrians, and make a separate peace with that monarch who was known to be favorable to France. Once in the fertile plains of northern Italy, the army could draw its supplies from the country. Such was the striking plan which a year later he himself was to carry into execution, thereby gaining undying fame. Notwithstanding the favor of Barras, Napoleon's affairs were again at low ebb. On the 15th of September his name was stricken from the list of generals on active service, on the ground that he had refused to accept the post to which he had been appointed. He was forced to sell his books, to ask the assistance of his brother Joseph, and to borrow money from the actor Talma. At this moment there came a most dramatic change in his fortunes. The promulgation of the new Constitution of the year 3 of the Republic had been followed by an open revolt of the sections, and all Paris was soon in a state of insurrection. The new Constitution was moderate in character, and was designed to put an end forever to the Reign of Terror. The executive and legislative powers were no longer to be united in the National Assembly. The executive authority was to be vested in a Directory of 5 men, while the legislative power was to be confided to 2 chambers instead of 1, a Council of Ancients and a Council of 500. The 5 directors were to be chosen by the Ancients from a list drawn up by the 500, and were to have charge respectively of foreign affairs, finance, war, justice, and the interior. The new Constitution was satisfactory neither to the extreme radicals nor to the Royalists, who were already talking of restoring the monarchy. To protect themselves against a probable attack from the Paris populace, the government ordered to the capital a few thousand troops of the line. This precaution inflamed the wrath of the Parisians who were opposed to the Convention. All but 4 of the 48 sections of the city revolted, assembled some 30,000 troops of the National Guard, and on the 4th of October successfully resisted General Menou, in command of the forces of the Convention. The Convention was in a panic, and turned to Barras, who was put in supreme command. But Barras was not a military man, and he had sense enough to know it. In his dilemma, he thought of the young artillery officer who had distinguished himself at Toulon. He was a Corsican, and it was not likely, therefore, that he would have any sympathy with the enemies of the Convention. Barras sent for General Bonaparte, and offered him the active command of the forces of the Convention, which he at once accepted. The National Guard outnumbered the troops of the Convention by more than 5 to 1, but they had no cannon. Everything depended, therefore, upon getting the ordnance from the artillery park at Sablon to the Tuileries. This task was entrusted by Napoleon to his future brother in law, Murat, a dashing cavalry officer, who carried it out successfully. Murat and his men rushed to the camp outside the city at full speed, drove back the insurgents who were trying to seize the cannon, and dragged them to the Tuileries, where they arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning. Neither the little general nor the dashing cavalier at the moment dreamed that this exploit was to win for each of them a crown. The cannon were placed at every point of vantage in the streets approaching the Tuileries, where the Convention was sitting. A little later in the morning the insurgents advanced to the attack. It was the 5th of October, or the 13 Vendémiaire by the Revolutionary calendar, a date ever memorable in the history of Napoleon and in the annals of France. When the insurgents saw the preparations made to receive them, they hesitated to attack. Suddenly a shot was fired which gave the signal for battle. As the police reports on the occurrences of this day are missing from the archives of Paris, it will never be known from which side this shot came. At once the streets were raked by the cannon of the Convention, and the strong position held by the insurgents at the church of St. Roch was carried. During the afternoon and evening the National Guards were driven back to the most remote quarters of the city, where they were easily captured and disarmed on the following day. This is what Carlyle, in his vivid but inaccurate way, calls the "whiff of grape shot which ended the French Revolution." After years of tumult, Paris had met its master. But the Revolution was not ended. It was to be perpetuated in a more orderly form of government. Napoleon had saved the Convention, and the Convention showed its gratitude. He was appointed General of Division and second in command of the Army of the Interior, and on the 26th of October he became the commander of the same army, when Barras assumed the position of Director in the new government. In a few weeks Napoleon had reached one of the highest military positions in France. In a letter to Joseph on the day of 13 Vendémiaire he said, "Fortune is on my side." From that time on his confidence in his star never wavered. End of chapter 3.